Trevor Noah is the successor to Jon Stewart as host of The Daily Show on Comedy Central. While in the United Kingdom, in May of 2018, he gave an interview on CNN, in which the interviewer, Christiane Amanpour, asked him a series of reasonable and fair questions.
You haven't been here, I think, for about 2 years, and you said a lot has happened in this country, and I guess around the world in those 2 years.
Right.
What?
Well, I mean, in many ways, for me, the UK has always been close to my heart, partly because of the history with South Africa, partly because this was my first international audience that I had after South Africa, and partly because I just kept up with what's been going on. You know, Brexit was in many ways the precursor to Trump. It was a movement that started, and now we've learned how closely tied it was because of Cambridge Analytica and the likes. So you really are dealing with a place that in many ways inspired a movement that you're seeing all over the world.
That's a fascinating hypothesis. The idea that the circumstances responsible for Donald Trump being elected president of the United States are actually rooted in the United Kingdom. Well, to make such a claim, and have any hope of demonstrating that you know what you're talking about, you'd be expected to provide an argument with some substance to it. But rather than making such an argument, Mr. Noah simply states how informed he is.
So I keep tabs on what Britain is going through, what the people are experiencing, what's happening in the UK, how Theresa May is doing as Prime Minister, and...
And what's your verdict? What grade?
This would serve as an opportunity for Trevor Noah to say something of substance.
I wouldn't give her a grade because I don't live here.
If Mr. Noah won't give his opinion of the UK's Prime Minister because he does not live in the UK, why did he bother stating that he's keeping tabs on the Prime Minister in the first place? We are permitted to have an opinion of leaders in other countries.
And what's your verdict? What grade?
I wouldn't give her a grade because I don't live here. I work off what people...
What do you get? What feeds into your comedy?
Once again, the dodging of one question prompts another question, and once again, Mr. Noah does not answer the question. What he does do is make the observation that people in limousines have a different point of view than people who ride subway trains.
What feeds into your comedy?
It depends on what mode of transport you're in the UK. That's what I find. So if you're in a private car, you might get a different reaction to when you're on the tube. So it all depends on who you ask and what mode of transport you're in, and it'll give you a different grade for what Theresa May is doing.
First of all, this is not unique to the United Kingdom. This is true everywhere. Second of all, this observation is about as obvious as water being wet, and third of all, it does not serve as an answer to either one of these fair questions. What would have passed for an answer to at least the second question would be if Noah cited an actual opinion that he encountered in a private car and then compared it to another actual opinion that he heard on the tube. If he had done that, he would have actually said something.
But he didn't say anything!
You're arriving right in the middle of this Windrush crisis.
Yes.
So many African Caribbeans who were invited to Britain to rebuild this country when there weren't enough people after the war and are suddenly finding themselves persona non grata. I wonder how you take that.
Much like the earlier theory that an American election was determined by a movement in many ways inspired within the UK, Mr. Noah proposes another fascinating hypothesis. And also much like the earlier theory, there is no substance whatsoever to back it up.
Unfortunately, this fairy tale that maybe we've told ourselves at times about how people have changed is not as true as we'd like it to believe. People are nicer when things are going well for them, but maybe that covers their true feelings and emotions. And so we have to ask ourselves, if people always feel economically downtrodden and then become racist, are they ever not being racist? Or is it just tied to economics? Or does being poor make you racist? Now, if that were true, then many people of color should be racist around the world, and that doesn't seem to be cause and effect. Or does being poor make you racist? Now, if that were true, then many people of color should be racist around the world, and that doesn't seem to be cause and effect. So I think, if anything, it shows you that, like, you know, there are a lot of issues that we don't deal with when things are going well.
Taken at face value, the claim made by Noah is that most people on Earth who are both poor and, of color are not racist. How he arrived at that conclusion is, of course, anybody's guess because he doesn't support this claim with any substance. The only thing that we can deduce with any certainty is that the interviewer is impressed, but without merit, because in substance, this answer was nothing more than a series of wild guesses. Mr. Noah presented those wild guesses in a very pleasant manner.
But he didn't say anything!
Perhaps the grandest question that was asked during this interview was the question relating to the differences between the 44th president and the 45th president.
You didn't spare President Obama the satirical side of your tongue.
Right.
How different is it wailing on him compared to wailing on Donald Trump?
Mr. Noah is not going to produce a concrete answer.
Oh, I mean, to try and compare the two would be not just false equivalency, but absolute madness. You know, anyone who tries to compare them has to admit that they're being crazy.
The first part of Noah's answer is an incorrect use of the false equivalence fallacy. A false equivalence is an attempt to make two things appear logically equivalent when in fact they are not. An example would be 1 is a number, 2 is a number, therefore 1 equals 2. That would be a false equivalence. But simply comparing two different things is not a false equivalence. Comparing the current US president to the previous US president is not a false equivalence. The question, for crying out loud, was about how different they are. And then to the second part of Noah's answer, that comparing Donald Trump and Barack Obama would be absolute madness. That doesn't mean anything. It's a dodge of this question. As is the following statement, anyone who tries to compare them has to admit that they're being crazy. A statement so empty it could just as well be replaced with really, come on, oh my god, get out of town, etc., etc., etc. In other words,
He didn't say anything!
Mr. Noah did not answer this question, but thankfully, in spite of how adorable the dodge of the question was, at least the interviewer realized that the question was dodged, and so she asked it again.
Anyone who tries to compare them has to admit that they're being crazy.
I'm just saying how different
I'm
is it
you,
as a comedian?
Oh wow, it cannot be more apparent. Like, one is ripe for comedy, one is, for instance, Donald Trump has left no contradiction unturned. That's his thing. Donald Trump is a gift to every level of comedy. If you want to, apply comedy or satire at the lowest level, Donald Trump is rife for that. You don't have to dig deeper. But if you do dig deeper, you will get more from him as well. Obama was, like many politicians, a water table that is buried far beneath the surface. So to get to the right joke and the right piece of satire that would really illuminate what Obama was doing, you had to dig through so many layers and work through the weeds to get to the water table of jokes. Donald Trump has water on the surface, and the deeper you dig, the more water you find. So I think that's the difference between them, is just there's more.
The only thing that Mr. Noah actually said was that there are more jokes to be told about Donald Trump than Barack Obama, which is ultimately a matter of opinion, and opinions supported by nothing. And there's a lesson to be learned from this particular interview. Unfortunately, for many of us, it's difficult to notice a lack of substance when the person speaking is very well spoken. For whatever reason, an answer that sounds good and feels good gives the impression that it is good. But all too often, a very pleasantly sounding answer to a fair question is essentially empty. It's a problem in and of itself, but it's especially troublesome when it comes from an influential figure with a large audience whose job requires them to say something of substance.